Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're diving into an essential part of course design, creating effective learning objectives. So whether you're a seasoned educator or just starting out, having clear learning objectives can really make a huge difference in your teaching and your students' learning. Learning objectives sometimes are the hardest part for me, I'll be honest. Knowing what exactly I want students to know can be really difficult, especially for a brand new course. I find I don't really quite know what I want them to know until after I've already dived into teaching. So learning objectives are something we're going to kind of create right at the beginning, but they're always going to be updated. They're always going to be refined and moved around, and you're going to kind of stumble into figuring out what you want students to know, and that's totally fine. That's how I do it every semester. But let's get started. Let's figure out how to do our learning objectives. So first off, what are learning objectives? They're simply put, they're just clear, concise statements that define what you want the students to know and what they should know by the end of the course. Honestly, most students skip over these. If we write them well enough and we kind of make them stand out really well, we can kind of guide the students to this is what we want you to know. And all of your assessments and all of your course design and everything else in the syllabus is really going to be tailored around these learning objectives. So we want them to be kind of as clear, as concise, and as to the point of what you want them to know as possible. So good learning objectives guide, again, the rest of your course design, how you're teaching, how you set up the lectures and activities in the course, and how you focus your students' attention on the learning efforts for what you want them to know. Now, within this, you really want to focus on a couple things, and that's whether or not you're wanting them to know a little bit more of the content of the course or the skills of the course or some type of mishmash of both. So for me, I'm a more skills over content kind of teacher. There's a lot of teachers that are more content over skills. I like to kind of weave them in together in my assessments in the way that I have students prepare information about how they're learning. I like to kind of put the skills in there, right? So for me, I teach psychology. One of the biggest skills is research skills. So being able to consume research or produce research. And so I will make sure that in every class I kind of teach that skill over and over and over again. And so what types of skills do you want them to learn? What type of content do you want them to learn? And how do we kind of get that mishmash of both together to advance? And I'll kind of come back to this in a little bit. I also throw in a lot of advising. I'm a part advisor, so I'm a teaching professor. I'm also an academic advisor. So I throw in a lot of advising to my classes. I want them to know what credit hours are, how much they should be working, career options in psychology and what they can do. And so I throw a lot of that into the class as well, and put those in my learning objectives a little bit that I want them to know where to go. So for example, in my history of psychology class, I designed an entire project around kind of exploring the history of the area of psych that they want for their careers. And that way they get a little bit of that advising of what does the career look like? What does it look like now? Where do I think it's going in the future? Where do I fit into that and all of that? So figuring out kind of what you want them to know, and it's going to be content related, right? So I want them to know the principles of psychology, the history of psychology. I want them to have those content. I also want them to have skills. I want them to be able to be good researchers, critical thinking skills, analyzing the different information and all of that stuff. I also want them to know things for themselves, how to learn, memory. I'm lucky that I teach psychology, so I get to teach how students should learn and how they can study and things like that in some classes. And so are those things that matter to you? The other thing to consider is whether your university has a policy on learning objectives. My university particularly makes sure that in all of our syllabi, the learning objectives that they have in the catalog for each class have to be included in the syllabus. And so I have to make sure that I have those learning objectives stated exactly the way that they have them, and then I can add on extra learning objectives after that. So make sure you know whether or not your university has a policy like that, already has learning objectives in place, if you're allowed to add on to them or not. That's going to kind of dictate how you kind of come up with your learning objectives. And then really dive deep into what you want them to know. And again, as you become more seasoned in teaching, this changes and you start to really understand, what maybe your students are missing, what you want them to know, and all of that. So without further ado, here's a step-by-step process. There's a worksheet linked below that you can work off of that follows this exact step-by-step process that can help you kind of get started in developing these learning objectives. So let's dive in. So for step one, we're going to identify key topics and skills. I've been talking about this already, so we'll kind of get this a little bit faster. But we want to list the main topics and skills that you want your students to learn. So what is that content that's priority, right? In an intro psych class, this is the hardest part because there's so much content to cover. How do I cover it all in that span of time? So you really want to sit down and say, okay, well, which content? For the intro to psych, I make sure that I cover those 5 pillars of psychology. So the 5 pillars of psychology are kind of the bio, cognitive, developmental, social, etc. And I make sure that that kind of stuff is being included. What kind of content do you have time to cover? Do you want to cover? Do you want them to know from your class? What skills do you need them to know? So think about what critical thinking skills, what practical applications, any relevant areas. You really want to think about, where are they going after this? So what do they need to know for future classes in the department? What does the department want them to know? Our department recently realized that we really want students to be able to analyze and understand kind of graphs in psychology a little bit more. So we've started implementing that type of skill building in additional classes besides just research methods and stats to make sure that they have that skill. So what skills does the department want? What skills do you want? What skills should they have to go on to future classes or future careers and things like that? And just start writing them all down and listing everything you want them to know. You're not going to include everything in all your learning objectives, but we really want to kind of purge what exactly do I want everybody to know? What would be that a dream scenario if I could get them to learn everything I want them to know? And at this stage in this first step, you're just listing all of them out. Some other resources that you can use that again are linked below and are available on my website. Some ones that I love is just this last month, I found the Learning Goals Inventory. It was developed by Elizabeth F. Barkley and Claire Howell Major. It is fantastic. It's basically just an inventory like we would take in any psychological test kind of thing, but it talks about different skills and different things that you want students to know. And when I took it, I was shocked that some of the stuff I thought would be more prominent of me wanting them to know wasn't, and other stuff I wanted them to know a little bit more. And so I recommend using that inventory for each class. You can kind of start to figure out what do you want them to know. Also the Skillful Psychology Student, it's a 1-page handout. It was created by a fantastic working group at the APA, and it really lists kind of the main skills that psychology students should know. And even if you're not teaching psychology, it's still helpful of different skills that you should learn, that students should learn, and ways to kind of put that into your learning. The last one I like to use a lot, and I use this in my classes, there's a graphic that comes with it, but there's also a huge document, is the American Academy of Colleges and Universities. Regularly, every few years, they put out a study of what most employers are looking for in terms of skills. And so I just take those top 10 skills and I put them in my learning objectives, and I remind students throughout the semester, we're working in groups because group work is kind of the number, 2 or 3 skill that employers are looking for. And so it kind of helps with that buy-in with students, also helps you developing those learning objectives of what skills are really important kind of going into their future. So again, all those are linked below and on my website if you need them. All right, so let's move to step 2, which is now we're going to start taking all of those skills and content and things that we want them to know, and we're going to start reducing it down to desired outcomes. So for each topic and skill, what should students be able to do by the end of the course, right? So if I want them to learn research skills, what I want them to be able to do by the end of the course, especially in an intro class, would probably be something along the lines of, being able to evaluate whether something is a legitimate research experiment or not. Being able to find an article on a library website and then understand that it's a journal article and not, a website kind of article. Something along those lines might be a skill that I want them to be able to do by the end of that class period. So we're going to use specific action verbs and make them specific and measurable so that we can, again, design the rest of our course based on those. So there's tons of resources. If you just Google Bloom's taxonomy, you can see these action verbs completely. So Bloom's taxonomy is kind of that triangle. It's what we want them to know at which different stages. So what do we want them to be able to kind of understand? What do we want them to be able to actually critically analyze, evaluate, apply? Do we want them to create something? So in capstone courses or senior level courses, we really want them to really design and create research experiments a little bit more. So it's kind of that idea of what type of verb, what do you want them to be able to do? And then within each of those, there's other verbs that you can do. So like if we were looking at what they can understand, we would want them to be able to like compare and contrast something, or relate to something, or extract something. If we want them to actually analyze, we're going to be looking at more like connections and relations and things of that nature. So what types of verbs are we using can be really important. And then moving on to step 3 is really aligning these things with that Bloom's taxonomy. I don't adhere to Bloom's taxonomy completely in that like it's a hierarchy and you have to get like these foundational things. I use it as more a guide with those verbs. What do I want them to be able to do by the end of the semester? And how am I going to make sure that I'm using more than one of these verbs, right? I don't just want them to understand or remember things, right? So I love recall, obviously. We do multiple choice questions, they're remembering, but we want them to maybe do a little bit more. So I make sure that I still have kind of that applying the information, analyzing, evaluating, critiquing, things of that nature. So that can help us align our objectives to those verbs and those ideas of what we're using. And when I was starting out, these verbs were really helpful to create learning objectives of just, okay, I want to make sure they're not just recalling the information that I'm telling them, and how do I get them to go deeper into that critical thinking. For example, for remembering psychological theories or for understanding, I could put something of like demonstrate knowledge of research methods, or for application, I could say something with the verbs of like identifying and describing psychological disorders. Or for analyzing, I could say that I want them to analyze different cognitive processes. For evaluating verb, I could say that we want them to assess the impacts of kind of social influences on behavior. So you can see how you can use those verbs to really start picking out that content and those skills we want them to learn at different points. All right, step 4 is ensuring SMART criteria. I also don't adhere to the SMART criteria completely. But what I really want to do with that SMART criteria is make sure that they are measurable, right? Because these learning objectives are going to set the stage for how we're going to design our assessments and our lectures and the rest of the course. And so if it's something that we can't measure in that span of time, so if I want them to be really good researchers, well, in an intro psych class, I can't measure whether they can create a research experiment. It's too much in that time period. And so that wouldn't really be a SMART criteria because it wouldn't be measurable and it wouldn't really be time bound into that situation. So we want to make sure that they are good criteria for the class that we're teaching, the time that we're given, and that they work for the students and for us. So just making sure that they're kind of specific, they're measurable, they're in that time that you have, and that we don't have too much built into the class. Because one thing I've learned from teaching is that sometimes I try to put way too much in, and less is more, especially when you're starting out. So make sure that you're making sure that they're measurable and achievable, and that we can kind of do it within that time period. All right, so step 5 is drafting the learning objectives. This is probably one of the hardest parts beyond, I think, that first step for me. But now we want to make sure that they're clear, concise, and we want to start drafting them. So you can take that Bloom's taxonomy so that you have at least, 5 learning objectives. 1, explain or understand, demonstrate, identify to analyze, evaluate, etc. So for example, some learning objectives that I would have in intro psych would be to explain the major psychological theories and their historical development, demonstrate an understanding of basic research methods in psychology, identify and describe the research from the 5 pillars of psychology, analyze cognitive processes, memory, decision-making, etc., and evaluate the impact of social influences on behavior. Those are some initial drafts that we might kind of put in using that Bloom's taxonomy, making sure that they're specific, right? So explain the major psychological theories. That's specific, it's measurable. I can measure that by a test. I can measure that by a writing assignment. I can measure that by talking in class or quizzes in class or things of that nature. And it's time bound. I can teach them whatever psychological theories I can teach in that time period. I can make sure that they know it in that time period. So making sure that it's that SMART. All right, and that brings us to step 6, the final is reviewing and refining. So our first draft, as we know, in anything being in grad school or having been in grad school, first drafts are never our final ones, right? So we're going to review it. We're going to make sure, again, that they sound good, that they're short, that they're easy for students to understand. We're going to make sure that they meet those SMART criteria, and then we're going to refine them. And another thing with reviewing and refining for me is that I don't just do this before the class starts or before I design the course. This is happening on a constant basis for me. I find during the class when I'm teaching is when I figure out what learning objectives I really want to concentrate, or which ones I can get rid of, or which ones need to be refined to be a little bit more clear for me or the students. And so I'm constantly drafting them. I actually start like my next semester syllabus right when the semester starts, and I start changing everything as I learn and evolve and figure out what's going wrong. So this refining process is ongoing. I've been teaching for 10 years, and I've been teaching the same classes for like the last 5 years, and I'm still refining and changing my learning objectives all the time. Another thing I like to do in my learning objective section on my syllabus is really just put, here's some skills that you'll be able to know at the end of the semester, that you can even just put on your resume. A lot of times students can't link these learning objectives to why they're important. And I feel like kind of calling that out of, here's why it's important. You can put this on your resume. These are the skills you're learning, right? You're not just, a lot of times in advising, students are like, but I haven't done anything. I haven't experienced anything. I don't have anything for my resume for grad school or for careers. And it's reminding them that these classes are that experience, and that these skills you're learning in the classes are valuable to that next step. And so that's all the steps. Again, there is a worksheet with all of these steps linked below and on my website that you can work through. So by following these steps, hopefully you'll be able to create effective learning objectives that guide your teaching and enhance the student's learning experience. And if you found this video helpful, please like, subscribe, or share it with other students. And then let me know in the comments below if you have any questions, or if you want to see any different type of content. And thanks for watching. Happy teaching.